The large hall was filled with bright lights and the sound of people talking in loud voices. The air smelled like expensive perfume and fancy food while waiters moved around carrying silver trays filled with glasses of champagne. The floor was made of white marble that shone under the chandeliers, and it was so clean that you could see your reflection in it. Men wearing black suits and expensive watches stood in groups laughing and joking while women in long colorful dresses moved gracefully between them, looking at the jewelry and talking about their rich lives. It was a night for the high-class people, the ones who had money and status and who wanted everyone else to know it. But in the middle of all this glamour there was a woman who did not belong to that world. She was older, maybe in her late 60s or early 70s, and she wore a plain blue uniform that had seen better days. Her shoes were old and comfortable, made for walking and not for dancing, and her gray hair was tied back in a simple bun. She pushed a large heavy cleaning cart across the edge of the room, trying to stay out of everyone's way. She was part of the staff, the invisible help that made sure the rich people could enjoy their night without worrying about the mess they left behind. No one looked at her directly. It was as if she was a ghost moving through the shadows of the party. Her name was not important to them. She was just the cleaner, the person who would pick up the empty glasses and wipe away the stains from the floor. She moved slowly because her knees hurt and her back ached from years of hard work, but her eyes were sharp and she noticed everything. She saw the way the men laughed too loud at jokes that were not funny, and she saw the way the women looked at each other with fake smiles, hiding their jealousy. She had seen this kind of thing many times before in her long life, and it made her feel tired, but she kept working because she needed the job. She stopped near a large trash bin to empty a small bag of dust and paper. She looked up and saw the grand piano standing alone in the corner of the hall. It was a beautiful instrument, black and shiny, with a lid that was propped open, showing the strings inside. It was the centerpiece of the room, waiting for the musician who was supposed to play later that night. The woman stared at the piano for a long time, her hands resting on the handle of her cart. She remembered how much she loved music when she was a little girl growing up in a small house with no money. Her parents had worked hard just to put food on the table, and they could not afford music lessons or a piano, but she had a neighbor who had an old piano in their living room, and sometimes she would hear them playing through the open windows. She would stand outside on the sidewalk and listen to the melodies, dreaming that one day she would be the one sitting on that bench making those beautiful sounds. She had taught herself to play on a broken keyboard at school and later on an old instrument in a church hall, but life got in the way. She had to work to help her family, and then she got married and had children, and there was no time for music or dreams. The piano in front of her looked like a magical object from a different life. It was polished to perfection, and the black surface reflected the lights of the room like a mirror. She stepped a little closer, forgetting about her cart for a moment. She wanted to touch the keys just once, to feel the cool ivory under her fingers, but she knew she was not allowed. The staff were told to stay away from the expensive equipment, and she did not want to lose her job. A young waiter walked past her and bumped into her cart, almost knocking it over. He did not say sorry, he just looked annoyed that she was in his way. She lowered her head and moved the cart back to the wall, feeling small and insignificant. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, not from her heart but from the weight of the years gone by. All the talent she had was buried inside her like a treasure at the bottom of the sea that no one would ever find. She looked at her hands. They were rough and red from the cleaning chemicals and the washing she did every day. These hands had scrubbed floors and washed thousands of dishes, but they had also once played complex chords and scales with grace and speed. Now they just looked like the hands of a tired old woman. The music for the night was supposed to start soon, and people were starting to look for their seats. The atmosphere was changing from casual talking to expectation. The woman watched as a group of young men walked by the piano. One of them was drunk and he leaned on the instrument carelessly, leaving a fingerprint on the shiny surface. The woman felt a surge of anger. She wanted to rush over and wipe it off, but she held back. She took a cloth from her pocket and walked over to the piano, pretending to be cleaning the area around it. She quickly and gently wiped the fingerprint away, restoring the piano to its perfect state. As she stood there so close to the keys she could almost hear the music in her head. She could imagine her fingers dancing on the black and white keys, playing a song that would make the room go silent. She closed her eyes for just a second and let the feeling wash over her. It was a bittersweet moment full of what could have been. She opened her eyes again and looked around the hall. No one was watching her. They were all busy looking at each other and at their drinks. She was truly invisible, and in that invisibility she found a strange kind of freedom. She stood there by the piano listening to the hum of the room and the sound of her own breathing, waiting for the night to unfold. Little did she know that this night would change everything and that her hands would soon do the talking in a way that no one expected. The lights dimmed a little and the room quieted down as the guests waited for the entertainment to begin. The woman stepped back into the shadows, leaning against her cart, ready to continue her work. But her heart was beating a little faster now as she looked at the empty bench and the silent keys, waiting for the music to begin. The clock on the wall kept ticking loudly and the time for the scheduled music performance had come and gone, but the seat behind the grand piano remained empty. The guests started to notice that something was wrong because they had been told there would be live music during their dinner and they were getting impatient. The atmosphere in the room began to change from happy and relaxed to annoyed and tense. People started tapping their fingers on their tables and looking at their watches, wondering why the entertainment was late. The hotel manager was a young man who wanted everything to be perfect, but right now he was sweating and pacing back and forth near the stage area. He held a phone to his ear, trying to get an answer from the musician who was supposed to be there, but the line just kept ringing without an answer. Finally someone picked up and the manager listened for a moment with a horrified look on his face. It turned out that the pianist had been in a minor car accident on his way to the venue and he would not be able to perform that night. The manager put his phone in his pocket and looked around at the angry crowd, not knowing what to do. He knew that these guests were important people and if they did not get the show they paid for, they would complain to the owners and he might lose his job. He was desperate and felt trapped in a corner with no way out. In the middle of the room a group of young wealthy men were drinking expensive wine and laughing loudly at their own jokes. One of them was a tall man with a loud voice who seemed to enjoy being the center of attention. He saw the manager looking stressed and panicked and decided to use this moment to show off to his friends. He pointed at the manager and made a mean comment about how incompetent the hotel staff was for letting something like this happen. His friends laughed and encouraged him to be even louder. The man looked around the room for something else to make fun of and his eyes landed on the older woman who was cleaning the tables near the back. She was slowly wiping down a surface and looking at the piano with a sad expression on her face. The young man smirked and nudged his friend, pointing in her direction and suggesting that since the hotel could not find a real musician, they should just let the cleaning lady play a song for them. The thought of this old uneducated woman trying to play classical music on the expensive piano seemed hilarious to them. The young man stood up from his chair and walked over to the manager with a cruel smile on his face. He told the manager that he had a solution to the problem and that he should just ask the cleaner to play because she had been staring at the piano all night. He spoke loudly enough for the people sitting nearby to hear him and a ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The manager shook his head and said that was impossible because she was just part of the cleaning staff and surely she did not know how to play such complex music. But the young man insisted and pulled a thick roll of cash from his pocket. He waved the money in the air and said that he would bet $500 that the woman could not even play a single note correctly. He said it would be the comedy act of the night and everyone would get a good laugh out of it. The pressure from the crowd was building up and people started chanting for the manager to let her on stage just so they could have some entertainment. The manager looked at the money and then at the angry faces of the guests. He felt like he had no choice but to agree to the joke just to calm everyone down. The manager walked over to the woman with a heavy heart and a nervous feeling in his stomach. He could see that she was frightened by his approach because he was usually very strict with the staff. He told her that the piano player was not coming and that the guests wanted her to play a song. The woman was shocked and shook her head immediately, saying that she could not do it and that she did not want to embarrass herself. But the manager would not take no for an answer because he was afraid of losing his own job. He told her that she only had to play one simple song and that it would make the guests happy. He did not tell her that they were laughing at her and that it was all a cruel bet. He just kept pushing her towards the instrument. The woman looked at the crowd and saw the smirking faces of the rich people and she felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to run away and hide in the kitchen, but the manager was holding her arm gently and guiding her forward. The crowd went silent for a moment as they watched the old woman in her blue uniform walk towards the grand piano. They whispered to each other and pointed their phones at her, ready to record a video to post online so they could mock her later. The young man who made the bet sat back down with a satisfied look on his face, holding his drink and waiting for the comedy to begin. The woman reached the piano and her legs felt weak. She sat down on the bench and it felt very small and hard. She looked at the black and white keys in front of her and for a second she forgot about the people watching her. She remembered her old dream from when she was a child, but then the reality came crashing back and she realized that these people were waiting for her to fail. She took a deep breath and placed her shaking hands on the keys, ready to make a fool of herself just so the rich people could have a laugh. The room was completely silent as she sat on the small bench in front of the massive instrument. The only sound was the soft rustle of clothes as people shifted in their seats to get a better view. Every eye was on her and hundreds of phone cameras were pointed in her direction, recording every moment, but not because they expected greatness. They were waiting for a failure. They wanted to see an old woman make a fool of herself so they could laugh about it later. The air in the room felt heavy with anticipation and cruelty. The young man who had made the bet leaned back in his chair with a smirk on his face, swirling his drink and looking at his friends with a self-satisfied expression as if he had already won the game. He thought that forcing the cleaning lady to play was the funniest thing that had happened all night. The manager stood near the side of the stage, wringing his hands together and sweating nervously. He felt guilty for forcing her into this position, but he was also terrified of the angry guests and hoped she would just play a few notes and leave quickly so they could move on with their evening. The woman looked down at the keys and they seemed to stare back at her like old friends she had not seen for a very long time. Her hands were resting on her lap and she took a deep breath to steady her nerves. She could feel her heart beating fast against her ribs, but she tried to ignore the fear and focus on the music. She remembered the feeling of the piano from her youth, the way the vibration would travel up her arms and into her soul. She closed her eyes for a brief second and blocked out the lights and the faces of the rich people. She pretended she was back in that old church hall or in her small living room where no one could judge her. Then she opened her eyes and placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers were rough and wrinkled, but they were steady. The first note she played was not quiet or hesitant. It was a loud and powerful chord that seemed to explode into the silence of the room. The sound was deep and rich and it bounced off the high ceiling and the marble walls. The shock of the sound made a few people jump in their seats because they were expecting something soft and clumsy. The laughter that had been bubbling in the room died instantly as if someone had turned a switch. The smirk on the young man's face faltered and faded away, replaced by a look of confusion. The sound was too perfect, too clear to be a joke. It was the sound of a professional instrument being played with authority. Without pausing, she began to play a complex and difficult piece that required both hands to move independently and with great speed. Her left hand played a steady rhythmic bass while her right hand flew up and down the keyboard, playing a melody that was fast and intricate. The music was not simple or childish, it was sophisticated and full of emotion. It started low and rumbling like a storm approaching, and then it climbed higher, becoming sharper and more intense. The people in the front row stopped chewing their food and put down their forks. They stared at the stage with their mouths slightly open, unable to believe what they were hearing. The transformation in the woman was incredible to watch. She was no longer the hunched and tired cleaner who went unnoticed in the corners of the room. She sat up straight and her shoulders moved with the rhythm of the music. Her face, which had been worried and scared a moment ago, was now calm and focused. Her eyes were fixed on the keys, but she seemed to be looking through them into another world. The years seemed to fall away from her face and her hands moved with a speed and agility that defied her age. Her arthritis and her tired muscles seemed to vanish as the music took over. She hit every note with precision, her fingers dancing across the ivory keys like they were light as feathers. The crowd began to realize that something special was happening. The atmosphere in the room shifted from mocking to amazed. The waiters who had been moving around the tables stopped in their tracks to listen. The hotel manager looked up from the floor with a look of total shock on his face. He could not understand where this talent had come from. He had seen this woman cleaning floors for years and never knew she possessed such a gift. The phones that were recording were now capturing a masterpiece. Instead of a comedy act, the viewers on the other side of those screens would be just as stunned as the people in the room. The music grew louder and more passionate. It filled every corner of the vast hall and seemed to vibrate right through the floor and into the bones of the audience. The melody was sad and beautiful at the same time, telling a story of lost dreams and hard times, but also of hope and survival. It was the kind of music that could make a stranger cry, and it demanded respect from anyone who heard it. The young man who had made the cruel bet sat motionless, his drink forgotten in his hand. He stared at the stage with a blank expression, realizing that he had made a terrible mistake. He had tried to humiliate someone who was clearly superior to him in talent and dignity, and now he was the one who looked small and foolish. The complexity of the piece was incredible. Her fingers moved so fast that they were almost a blur, and yet she never missed a beat. She played sections that were incredibly difficult with an ease that suggested she had been practicing for hours every day for her entire life. The sound of the piano was now the most important thing in the world, and the silence of the audience was a sign of respect that no money could buy. The woman was in her element, and the grand piano was singing under her fingers, exactly as it was meant to do. She was not just pressing keys, she was pouring her heart and soul into the instrument, and the result was a performance that no one would ever forget. The music began to change and become faster and more aggressive, like a storm rolling in over the mountains. Her fingers moved with a blur of motion that was hard to follow with the naked eye. She played notes high up on the keyboard that sounded like crystal bells ringing in the distance. Then she would dive down to the low end and create deep rumbling sounds that shook the floorboards. The contrast between the soft and loud parts was handled perfectly, and it showed a level of control that only comes from a lifetime of practice. The crowd in the hall was completely paralyzed by the sound. Waiters stood frozen with trays held high in the air, forgetting to serve the tables. Chefs had come out of the kitchen doorway to see what was happening and stood wiping their hands on their aprons with wide eyes. The young man who had made the cruel joke stared at the stage without blinking. His face had turned pale, and he gripped his glass so hard that his knuckles turned white. He felt a sinking feeling in his stomach as he realized that he had tried to humiliate a master. The laughter that had filled the room just a few minutes ago was gone, replaced by a heavy, odd silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when something truly miraculous takes place. The manager felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the woman. He thought about all the times he had walked past her without saying hello or looking her in the eye. He felt a deep sense of regret for his arrogance and for the way he had treated her. He realized that she was not just a cleaner but a human being with a rich and complex history. The music she played was not just a collection of notes, it was a story. It sounded like a memory of a place that no longer existed. There was a sadness in the melody that made some of the guests reach for their napkins to wipe away tears. Even the toughest-looking men in the room felt a strange tightness in their chests. The music bypassed their brains and spoke directly to their hearts. The woman on the bench was sweating now, and a strand of gray hair had fallen loose from her bun. But she did not stop to fix it. She was pouring every ounce of her energy into the performance. Her back was straight and her head was held high. She looked years younger than she had when she was pushing her cleaning cart. There was a fire in her eyes that had been missing for a long time. It was the fire of passion and the joy of doing what she was born to do. Her hands seemed to have a mind of their own. They moved across the 88 keys with a speed and accuracy that was breathtaking. She played complicated runs and trills that would have been difficult for a professional pianist half her age. Yet she made it look effortless. Her fingers danced over the ivory like they were light as feathers. The sound filled every corner of the huge hall. It bounced off the crystal chandeliers and the marble walls, creating a surround sound of pure beauty. The complexity of the piece increased and the rhythm became driving and insistent. It felt like the heart of the room was beating along with the music. The audience was captivated. They were no longer judging her clothes or her job. They were witnessing greatness. It was a reminder that talent and art do not care about social status or bank accounts. The young man slumped down in his chair, feeling defeated. He knew that no amount of money could buy the kind of talent he was hearing. He had been stripped of his arrogance by the sheer power of her performance. The music swelled to a new height. The notes cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall of sound. It was intense and emotional and overwhelmingly beautiful. The woman lost herself completely in the music. She was not thinking about the audience or the bet or the manager. She was just playing. It was the most alive she had felt in decades. And the whole world was listening. Music reached its highest point and her hands moved faster than ever before, playing a cascade of notes that sounded like rain falling on a tin roof. The energy in the room was at its peak and everyone was holding their breath. She played a final series of loud and deep chords that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. And then with one last gentle press of the keys she brought the music to a sudden and complete stop. Her hands stayed hovering over the keys for a moment as the final vibrations faded away into the air. The hall went completely silent. It was not the polite silence that people usually give to a performer. It was a shocked and heavy silence. No one moved and no one spoke. It was as if time had stopped inside the room. The hundreds of people sat staring at the stage with their mouths open, unable to process what they had just heard. The sound of the piano still seemed to be ringing in their ears. The young man who had made the joke sat frozen in his chair. His face was red and he looked down at his feet, unable to look at the woman on the stage. He felt a deep sense of shame that burned in his chest. He realized that his arrogance had made him look like a fool in front of everyone. The woman sat on the bench for a moment longer, looking at her hands. They were trembling slightly from the effort. Slowly the strength seemed to leave her body and her shoulders slumped forward again. The magic of the music was fading and reality was coming back. She was no longer the brilliant concert pianist in their minds. She was just the elderly cleaner in the blue uniform again. She stood up slowly and smoothed down the front of her dress. She looked out at the crowd with tired eyes. She did not smile or bow like a performer who was seeking fame. She just looked shy and embarrassed by all the attention. Suddenly a man in the front row stood up and started to clap his hands together loudly. He was followed by another person and then another. Within seconds the entire room was on their feet. The sound was deafening. People were cheering and whistling and shouting for more. The applause was not polite. It was a roar of admiration and respect. The manager stood near the stage with his hands on his head. He could not believe that the woman he had hired to clean floors had created such a masterpiece. He felt a mix of pride for his staff and regret for his own blindness. He walked towards the stage intending to offer her a permanent job as the hotel musician. He wanted to tell her that she never had to clean another toilet as long as she lived. But the woman did not wait for him. She did not bask in the glory or the applause. She simply gave the crowd a small and humble nod. It was a gesture that said thank you but also asked them to please let her go. She turned around and walked away from the piano. She walked past the manager who was trying to get her attention. She did not stop to hear his praise or his offers of money and fame. She just kept walking with her head down. She walked past the table where the young man was sitting. He tried to say something to her, perhaps an apology. But she did not look at him. She moved past him like he was not there, treating him with the same invisibility that he had once treated her. She reached the corner of the room where her cleaning cart was waiting for her. It seemed strange to see her standing next to the dirty rags and the trash bags after what she had just done. But to her it was normal. This was her life. The music was a beautiful dream, but the cart was her reality. She picked up a damp cloth from the handle of the cart. She turned back to the room and started to walk towards a table that had some empty glasses on it. The crowd watched her in silence as she began to work again. They moved out of her way as she passed, showing her a respect that they had never shown before. People stopped talking as she approached and lowered their voices. It was as if they were afraid to disturb her. She picked up the glasses and wiped the table. Her hands were rough and used to hard work. They did not look like the hands of a magician. But everyone in that room knew the magic that those hands held. She finished cleaning the table and pushed her cart towards the kitchen doors. The manager watched her go. He wanted to stop her and make her stay. He wanted to tell the world who she was. But he knew that he could not force her. The performance was a gift that she had given them, and now she was taking it back. She pushed the heavy door open and disappeared into the dark hallway. The noise of the party started up again behind her. The band eventually started playing some recorded music and people went back to their drinks and their conversations. But the mood in the room was different. The arrogance was gone. The people talked quietly about the old woman and the music she had played. They talked about how they had misjudged her. And they talked about how beauty can be found in the most unexpected places. The young man left the party early. He walked out into the night air feeling humbled. He realized that money could not buy class or talent. And he learned a lesson that he would never forget. Inside the kitchen, the woman emptied her tray and washed her hands. The other staff members looked at her with wide eyes. They had heard the music coming from the hall. They smiled at her and nodded their heads in respect. She smiled back at them, a small tired smile. She poured herself a cup of water and drank it slowly. Her fingers ached but her heart felt light. She had proven to herself that she still had it. She had shown the world that she was more than just a cleaner. But she did not need their applause to know her own worth. She hung up her apron and clocked out for the night. She walked out of the hotel through the back entrance. The night was cool and quiet. She walked to the bus stop alone. She sat on the bench and waited for the bus to take her home. She looked up at the stars in the sky and took a deep breath. It had been a long and hard day. But as she sat there in the darkness, she could still hear the music in her head. And it was beautiful.